The name itself sounds innocent enough to evoke memories of childhood sweetness and sugar-coated treats. The Candyman is a title that suggests a benevolent figure who brings joy to the neighborhood children with pockets full of sweets. However, in the annals of true crime history within the United States, this moniker belongs to one of the most prolific and depraved serial killers the nation has ever seen. The reality behind the nickname is not a story of generosity, but a nightmare of deception and betrayal that shattered the innocence of an entire community. We are peeling back the layers of urban legend to reveal the terrifying truth of Dean Corll and the Houston mass murders, which remain the worst case of serial murder in American history for decades. Houston in the early 1970s was a booming metropolis filled with optimism and the promise of expansion. The space age was in full swing, and the city was growing rapidly, with families flocking to the suburbs for a slice of the American dream. The Heights was a working-class neighborhood where people knew each other, and children played in the streets until the streetlights flickered on. The humid Texas air hung heavy over the quiet avenues, where nothing sinister seemed to lurk. It was in this unassuming environment that a predator established his hunting ground. He did not hide in the shadows, but stood in plain sight smiling at the very people he planned to destroy. Dean Arnold Corll was a figure who defied the stereotypical image of a monster. He was an electrician, and he worked at the family-owned Corll Candy Company, which earned him his infamous nickname among the local youth. He was known for giving out free candy to the neighborhood kids and letting them hang out at his house. To the parents, he was the polite young man who lived with his mother and kept to himself. To the teenagers, he was the cool older friend who had a car and money and did not enforce the strict rules of their parents. This carefully constructed persona was the mask he wore to conceal a dark and twisted interior that craved control and suffering. The myth of the stranger in the white van offering candy is a cautionary tale told to children everywhere. In this case, the danger did not come from a transient stranger, but from a man who was woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Corll understood that trust was the most effective weapon in his arsenal. He groomed not just his victims, but the entire community into believing he was harmless. He capitalized on the generational gap of the era, offering a sanctuary to boys who felt misunderstood by their fathers and mothers. His residence became a clubhouse where inhibitions were lowered, and the first steps toward a tragic end were taken without anyone suspecting a thing. The operation was not a solo endeavor, which is one of the most chilling aspects of this case. Corll recruited accomplices from the very pool of teenagers he befriended. David Owen Brooks was a local teen who fell into the orbit of Dean Corll. Brooks was not just a victim of manipulation, but became an active participant in the procurement of other boys. The dynamic between Corll and his young accomplices was complex and rooted in a perverse system of rewards and coercion. Corll provided them with vehicles and money, and a sense of power that they could not find elsewhere in their young lives. This triad of terror would go on to operate for 3 years without detection. Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. was another teenager who joined this macabre inner circle. Henley was a high school dropout who was initially a potential victim, but managed to talk his way into a partnership. He became the primary recruiter for Corll, using his social status and connections to lure friends and acquaintances to the house. Henley would invite boys over for parties, or offer them rides, or promise them a good time hanging out at the bachelor pad of his older friend. The betrayal here is profound, as victims were often led to their doom by a face they recognized and trusted implicitly. The boys walked willingly into the trap, believing they were just going to have fun. The method of abduction was terrifyingly efficient because it relied on social engineering rather than brute force. Once the boys were inside the residence, the atmosphere would shift from a casual hangout to a scene of horror. The glue-sniffing parties were a common ruse used to intoxicate the victims and lower their defenses. Corll had constructed a torture board and had installed handcuffs on the walls of his home. He would often trick the boys into allowing themselves to be handcuffed by suggesting it was a magic trick or a feat of strength. By the time the victims realized the danger, it was far too late to escape the clutches of the Candyman. Between 1970 and 1973, boys began vanishing from the heights and surrounding areas of Houston at an alarming rate. Parents were frantic and contacted the police department repeatedly to report their sons missing. However, the prevailing attitude of law enforcement at the time was that these teenage boys were simply runaways. The counterculture movement was active, and it was not uncommon for young people to hitchhike to California or Florida. Police dismissed the disappearances as voluntary departures and failed to connect the dots between the growing number of missing files. This negligence allowed Corll and his accomplices to continue their spree uninterrupted for years. The parents of the missing boys formed their own network of grief and investigation. They refused to believe that their sons had simply abandoned their families without a word. They plastered flyers on telephone poles and knocked on doors and harassed the police for answers that never came. The community was gripped by a silent panic where everyone knew someone who had disappeared, but no one knew why. The sheer number of missing children from such a concentrated geographic area should have triggered a massive manhunt. Instead, the files gathered dust in the precinct, while the list of victims grew longer with each passing month. The breaking point came on the sweltering morning of August 8, 1973. Elmer Wayne Henley arrived at the house of Dean Corll in Pasadena, Texas, accompanied by a young woman and another friend named Timothy Curley. Corll was furious that Henley had brought a girl to the house, which violated their strict rules of secrecy. The tension in the house escalated rapidly as Corll made threats against the new guests. He bound and handcuffed Henley and threatened to kill him and his friends. This moment marked the collapse of the twisted hierarchy that had governed their relationship. The predator had finally pushed his apprentice too far. In a desperate act of self-preservation, Henley managed to convince Corll to untie him by promising to cooperate with the murder of the other two guests. Once he was free, Henley grabbed a .22 caliber pistol that Corll kept in the house. As Corll advanced on him with a knife, Henley fired the weapon. The bullet struck Corll and ended the life of the mastermind behind the Houston mass murders. The reign of terror had come to a violent conclusion, not by the hands of the law, but by the hand of a co-conspirator. Henley then called the police to report that he had shot a man in self-defense. When the Pasadena police arrived at the scene, they initially treated the incident as a domestic dispute or a homicide resulting from a quarrel. They had no idea that they were standing in the home of a serial killer. They found the body of Dean Corll on the floor and took Elmer Wayne Henley into custody. It was during the interrogation that the facade began to crumble. Henley did not just confess to the shooting of Corll. He began to talk about the other boys. He told the detectives that there were others and that they were buried in a boat shed nearby. The officers were skeptical at first, but they agreed to investigate the claim. The investigators traveled to a rented boat shed in southwest Houston to verify the story told by the terrified teenager. The air inside the shed was stifling and smelled of earth and decay. They began to dig in the dirt floor of the shed. What they found shattered their composure and made headlines around the world. They uncovered body after body buried in shallow graves covered with lime and plastic. The sheer density of the burial site was horrific. The detectives realized with dawning horror that they were not dealing with a few isolated murders, but a mass grave of unprecedented scale. The excavation of the boat shed was a grueling and traumatic process for everyone involved. The recovery team had to work carefully to exhume the remains of 17 bodies from that single location. The victims were piled on top of one another in a grotesque display of disregard for human life. Personal items and clothing were found mixed in with the soil, offering heartbreaking clues to the identities of the boys. The heat of the Texas summer made the task even more unbearable. As the body count rose, the media descended on Houston, turning the investigation into a national spectacle. Henley and Brooks, who was also taken into custody, provided information about additional burial sites. They directed police to a wooded area near Lake Sam Rayburn, which was a popular recreational spot. There the investigators found more shallow graves. The expansive nature of the crimes became clear as the geography of the murders stretched across different counties. Dean Corll had used multiple locations to hide the evidence of his atrocities. The search at Lake Sam Rayburn yielded 4 more bodies, adding to the growing list of victims. The tranquil forest had been turned into a secret cemetery for the missing youth of Houston. The third location identified by the accomplices was High Island, which is a beach area on the Bolivar Peninsula. This site proved to be difficult for investigators because the shifting sands and tides had disturbed some of the graves. However, they managed to recover the remains of 6 more victims buried in the sand. The desolation of the beach provided a stark contrast to the suburban boat shed, but the horror remained the same. The total count of recovered bodies was climbing toward 30, making it the deadliest case of serial murder the United States had ever witnessed at that time. The task of identifying the victims fell to Dr. Joseph Jachimczyk, the Harris County medical examiner. The state of decomposition made visual identification impossible for many of the boys. The medical examiner had to rely on dental records and skeletal anomalies, and the few personal effects found in the graves. It was a slow and painstaking process that required months of work. For the parents of the missing boys, it was a time of agonizing suspense. They waited by their telephones hoping for news, while simultaneously dreading the confirmation that their son was among the dead. As the names of the victims were released, the scale of the tragedy became personal. These were not nameless statistics, but beloved sons and brothers and friends. They were boys like Billy Balch and Mally Winkle and countless others who had their whole lives ahead of them. The realization that they had been lured away by a trusted neighbor and betrayed by their own peers caused a collective trauma in Houston. The city had to grapple with the fact that a monster had lived among them, and that the systems designed to protect their children had failed miserably. The investigation revealed that Dean Corll had kept a detailed log of his crimes, though it was never found. The accomplices described how Corll would save souvenirs and take photographs of the boys. This fetishization of the murders added another layer of revulsion to the case. The police were criticized heavily for their handling of the missing persons reports. If they had taken the initial disappearances seriously and investigated the connections between the boys, they might have stopped Corll years earlier. The phrase runaway became a symbol of law enforcement negligence in the eyes of the grieving families. Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks were charged for their roles in the murders. The trials were sensational and drew crowds of spectators. Henley attempted to portray himself as a victim who was forced to participate under duress, but the evidence of his active recruitment and participation was damning. Brooks also faced the full weight of the legal system. The defense tried to argue that Corll was the sole mastermind, and the boys were merely pawns, but the jury saw the blood on their hands. Both young men were convicted, and sentenced to life in prison, effectively ending their freedom forever. The legacy of the Dean Corll case is a dark cloud that still hangs over Houston history. It changed the way police departments handle missing persons cases involving teenagers. It shattered the illusion of safety in suburbia and taught a generation of children to be wary of everyone, including the friendly man next door. The myth of the Candyman is often sensationalized in pop culture, but the reality is a somber reminder of human cruelty. The true story is not about a mythical boogeyman, but about a manipulative psychopath who exploited the trust of his community. Debunking the myth requires us to look at the mundane nature of evil. Dean Corll was not a supernatural entity. He was an electrician who paid his taxes and mowed his lawn. He was a son who lived with his mother. This normalcy is what makes him so terrifying. It proves that evil does not always look like a monster. It can look like a neighbor offering a ride or a friend offering a piece of candy. The banality of his cover allowed him to operate in the daylight while hiding a world of darkness just behind his front door. The aftermath of the case left a scar on the psyche of the nation. It was one of the first times that the term serial killer entered the public consciousness in such a visceral way. The sheer number of 28 known victims was unfathomable. There are still believed to be other victims who were never found and families who never got closure. The search for the truth did not end with the conviction of Henley and Brooks. It continues for the amateur sleuths and historians who try to piece together the final secrets of the man they called the Candyman. The physical locations associated with the crimes have largely been erased by time. The house where Corll lived and died has been remodeled, and the boat shed was torn down long ago. The landscape of Houston has changed with new developments covering the scars of the past. However, the memory of what happened remains etched in the minds of those who lived through it. The story serves as a grim historical marker for the end of a more innocent era. It was the moment when the community realized that they could not take their safety for granted. Today, we look back at the Dean Corll case, not to glorify the killer, but to remember the victims. We tell their stories to ensure that they are not forgotten in the shadow of the murderer. We analyze the failures of the investigation to learn lessons that can prevent future tragedies. The myth of the Candyman figure is deconstructed to show the mechanics of predation. It serves as a warning about the dangers of overlooked youth and the importance of listening to families when they say something is wrong. The psychological profile of Dean Corll remains a subject of study for criminologists. His ability to compartmentalize his life was extraordinary. He could torture and murder a boy in the evening and then go to work the next morning as if nothing had happened. This level of dissociation is rare and indicates a profound psychopathy. Understanding his mind is key to understanding how such a massive series of crimes could go undetected for so long. It forces us to question how well we really know the people around us. The role of the accomplices Henley and Brooks adds a layer of complexity that is rare in serial murder cases. Usually, the killer works alone. The fact that Corll was able to corrupt two teenagers into becoming mass murderers is a testament to his manipulative power. It raises disturbing questions about the nature of influence and the malleability of morality in young people. The triad of killers created a closed loop of validation, where murder became normalized as a part of their daily routine. In the end, the story of the Candyman is a tragedy of missed opportunities. There were moments when Corll could have been caught. There were neighbors who heard screams but did not call the police. There were parents who provided leads that were ignored. The system failed the boys of the Heights at every turn. Debunking the myth means accepting the uncomfortable truth that society played a role in enabling the killer through indifference and negligence. It is a heavy burden that the city of Houston still carries. As we conclude this examination of the Dean Corll case, we are left with the haunting images of the boys who never came home. We see their faces in the faded photographs and hear the echoes of their laughter in the quiet streets of the Heights. The Candyman was not a myth, but a man of flesh and blood who chose to embrace darkness. The true horror lies not in the nickname, but in the reality of the 28 lives stolen and the potential that was extinguished. We remember them, and we remain vigilant, ensuring that such darkness is never allowed to thrive unnoticed again. The final question that lingers is whether all the victims have truly been found. With the passage of 50 years, memories fade and evidence is lost. Yet the possibility remains that there are still secrets buried in the Texas soil. The story of the Houston mass murders is a closed chapter in the legal sense, but an open wound in the heart of history. It stands as a permanent reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring need for justice. The myth is debunked, but the sorrow remains eternal.